This is the Dallas Morning News.
Welcome to the second season of Beyond Talking Points, an American Middle podcast. I'm Abby McCloskey. We're here to talk all about President Trump's first 100 days, what America was promised and what we're getting. And today it's all about kids and family, from RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again to the closure of the Department of Education, falling fertility rates, screen time for kids, and more. There's so much to talk about. Thank you for joining us, and let's dive in. I'm here with Emily Oster to talk about kids and family policy. Emily, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I was talking with a fellow Dallas mom about our conversation today, and she said, Emily seems like a cool cat. And I was thinking about why she would say this, and it's, well, you're cool, but also because so many mothers across America feel like they know you. They've read one of your 4 New York Times bestselling books that take people really into some of the most intimate parts of parenting, from how to do a sleep schedule to breastfeeding to if you can have wine or not when you're pregnant. And a lot of moms have listened to your podcast that you've had with the Free Press about parenting, and the Free Press introduced you this way, which I just love. They said, Poseidon is the god of the sea, Dionysus of wine and merrymaking, and Emily Oster, she's the god of parenting. So really hard to beat that intro, so I won't try. But you're a renowned economist at Brown University. You are an expert on all things kids, parenting, families. And so let's just start at the top. Emily, what's the state of kids in America relative to when you and I were young back in the late 70s, mid 1980s?
I think it's a hard question to answer because there's always a temptation to be looking back and saying, oh, things were so much better in my day. And of course, there are many ways in which, the lives that we lead and lives our kids lead now have many more choices and many more opportunities and, many more options, which is great.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think there are some stressors on kids now that were not there in the 80s. And I think part of what's very hard as a parent is that, trying to navigate really quite a different landscape on some dimensions than we did as kids. And it's then hard to know exactly how kids are doing. There are certainly ways in which we've seen what I think many people would view as improvements. So, for example, teen pregnancy rates are way down relative to where they were in an earlier period. Some forms of violence, bullying, that kind of stuff in schools, I think, is generally down. Acceptance for kids in LGBTQ settings are much better. On the other hand, there are declines in mental health, certainly relative to when we were kids. And I think that's a pretty big one that is on a lot of people's minds. And you see that in a lot of different pieces of data. And I'm sure we can talk about, why people think that's true. And then there are other metrics, things like health, where, we have seen, say, increases in obesity rates. So there's things that are better, and then there's things that are worse. And then there's this overlay of it's just very hard for people to parent in an environment in which the world feels really different. And like it's your own experience is perhaps not as helpful as it might be.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned mental health, and we'll put a pin on that. I want to come back to that because it's such a huge issue impacting kids and families. It feels like so much is uncertain and maybe different than when I was young. There's a lot of distrust around the kind of systems of power. And so I want to use that as a segue into this first area of how kids and parents are doing, which is all about health. And there's the Make America Healthy Again campaign, which is really the baby of RFK Jr., who's now secretary of HHS, which is the Health and Human Services Department. The issue of kids' nutrition has really struck a chord, I feel like, all across the political spectrum, from crunchy moms to conservative moms to homeschool moms to progressive moms. And there's a belief that the system, in some ways, has been rigged in a way that's making our kids unwell, from obesity just to cellular structure, and a feeling that Washington has ignored it. And so as someone who's so soaked in the literature on these things, are there too many additives in our food for kids? And is there something Washington can or should be doing about it?
Yeah, I think it's really important to separate sort of two things. So, one is the question of kind of what things about dietary choices are important. So, there are we know in some vague sense that, a diet that contains vegetables and has some fiber and, doesn't have too many calories, like that, those things are important. And many people, just to be clear, are not getting those basic things. So I really, as much as I have many differences with RFK Jr., many differences, I do think a focus on, how can we improve the quality of the basic foods that our kids are eating. So, for example, how can we improve the quality of food in school lunches, which actually is something that I think both sides of the aisle have tried at various times to do. It feels like a place where policy could really matter. I think that's pretty important. I worry a little bit that we're getting hung up on some things which actually the data really doesn't suggest matter and seem implausible that they would be very important in terms of magnitude. So, when people talk about like it's really important to get food dyes out of the food system, look, there really isn't a lot of evidence that these food dyes are bad in any particular way. Are they necessary? No. Do they make people enjoy food more? Yes. Is there strong evidence that they're dangerous? No. When we spend all of our time kind of focusing on like, let's get rid of all the food dyes in school lunches, but we don't spend it on, how can we lower the sugar content in school lunches? How can we make sure that there are interesting vegetables that kids want to eat? That feels like we're missing an opportunity to focus on something that would matter in favor of focusing on something which seems like it might matter, but actually doesn't.
That's super interesting. And part of me wonders if it's just an emotionally triggering thing that when you turn over a carton or box of something and there's a bunch of ingredients that you don't know, that somehow it feels like, why is it whatever? You can see the sugar levels and protein levels, but why are there all these weird things? And I think it extends then out to maybe some suspicion of if there's all this stuff in our food, well, another kind of black box category of things is vaccines. Like, what's in those? What are those doing to us? As the same energy that's around getting bad stuff, quote unquote, or semi-bad stuff out of the food, then seems to translate over into medicine to say, what is Washington allowing to be put in people's bodies or mandating whatever with respect to vaccines and kids? And we're in a measles outbreak here in Texas. Just wondering if you could chat with me about that.
Yeah. So let me just put a pin in one thing you said before, which I think that there's a piece of this that's about, it's scary to look at the stuff on the back of the thing. I think there's also a piece that the loudest voices in this space are already doing the things that get you 95% of the way there. The people who are the loudest about food dyes are already, working on the things we know matter, like making sure their kids are eating some vegetables and fiber and all this kind of stuff. And so it really is important to remember that like the sort of sets of people who would benefit the most from an improved set of school lunches are actually like people with fewer resources, whose kids are getting a lot of their calories and a lot of their meals at school, for whom school lunch is the healthiest meal they have every day. So I worry that we're having this conversation sometimes inside, groups of people who are kind of like talking about how do we go from 95% to maybe 96% in terms of some health thing where, much of the country is kind of at 20 and boy, we could do a lot to get them to 60. So I think
I love that.
Like, that's an important part of the policy conversation. But on the question of vaccines, I think you're absolutely right that it's become a kind of almost like this is a tribe that I want to be part of that both doesn't like food dyes and also doesn't like vaccines and likes raw milk and doesn't like fluoride and like whatever is the constellation of, Make America Healthy Again movements. And, I've said this before, but I really worry that we're kind of tarring everything with the same brush and coming at this and saying, if you're a person who drinks raw milk, you also shouldn't vaccinate for measles. And really, those things are not similar. I don't drink raw milk, but I also don't think it's an insane position that someone might choose to do so for various preference reasons. I think the choice not to vaccinate your kids for measles has really significant potential downsides, and the evidence for safety of that is just really very good. So I'd like us to try to decouple this a bit and have it be possible to be a person who, thinks carefully about nutrition and, makes some choices about milk, but also vaccinates their kids. And I'm worried we're headed to a place where that's somehow not possible.
Yeah. And from the perspective of public policy, how do you think trust in a lot of ways can be restored to to Washington, who makes a lot of the decisions about what's allowed in food and what's not, and which vaccines get put out and which don't. I think it's really hard in the current kind of scattershot information environment to have any sense of authority of what's actually best for my kid.
Yeah. So during COVID, I think the left-leaning part of the public health establishment lost a lot of trust, partly for school closures, and then I think partly in the case of medicine, sort of pushing the vaccine for kids, which I don't think sat as well with many parents and probably wasn't especially important for public health. We now, of course, find ourselves in a situation in which we have the other side, so RFK it's just been revealed that, they're going to put somebody in charge of evaluating a link between autism and vaccines, a link which has been widely debunked many, many times. And now they're putting someone in charge of doing that who is well known as a person who is an anti-vaccine activist. And so I'm not sure that's a great way to generate trust either. I generally think we generate trust with people by explaining to them, why we know, what the evidence says, how much uncertainty there is, all the stuff that, I try to do in my writing. Policymakers have not generally proven to be very good at that type of communication, in my view.
Yeah. And which brings us to a shadow side of a lot of the health conversations, at least in my point of view, which is how mothers are doing. And maternal mortality rates in the US are higher than, I think, at least almost every other high income country in the world. They're going up, which seems insane in a time when we have AI and all the advances that somehow the very primal act of giving birth is becoming more dangerous here. Could you give a little bit of color on that before we kind of go on and talk about everything happening in education and screens and all the other issues we have to talk about?
Yeah, so we definitely have much higher maternal mortality rates than there should be. We've seen them going up. They particularly have risen in the most vulnerable groups. So the maternal mortality rate for Black women is about 2 to 3 times as high as it is for white women. So there is a lot of work to do there. I think part of what makes it hard is it's difficult. We're still talking about, thank goodness, actually relatively small number of deaths. And so it's sort of picking out what exactly is the problem, what exactly is the solution, has been really challenging. I think it's pretty clear that, things like paying more attention to people in sort of writ large is helpful. But exactly how do you, generate policy for that is not clear. We have a very different, in some ways, a much more medicalized birth system than many other countries. I think, there are certainly people here, and I don't think this is crazy, who would say, we need to really rethink, the ratio of usage of, obstetricians to midwives. And, we need low-risk people to be served by midwives. We need higher-risk people to be served more aggressively by obstetricians or maternal fetal medicine specialists. We just need to rethink how we're structuring this to serve people better, so we're meeting their needs.
Well, I hope that's a conversation that we continue to have, because I do feel like that's just such a huge area where there could be improvements made. But switching gears to education, student achievement, and you mentioned the school closures during COVID, that obviously had really detrimental effects on kids. We haven't recovered, even though there's variation across states, but few people talk about how student achievement in the US is dropping for the decade before that. And there's a lot of finger pointing. Some people are blaming new phonics and math curriculum. I mean, I've written about some of that. Some people blame a focus on DEI or social emotional learning away from just the basics. Some people blame the teachers' unions and funding. What is your take on what's happening with student achievement? And then we'll segue into how the Department of Education is related or not.
Yeah. So just to be clear first, the declines during COVID were much larger than any declines we had sort of seen up to that point. But You're right that it was not, it's not like we were accelerating to the moon and there was a small blip. And moreover, post-COVID, we've now had many years, and we still, in many states have not recovered. Some of them have gotten worse. So it's clear there's something else going on. You listed a bunch of different explanations. They all seem plausible. I think part of what
does the research say, though?
Right,
Emily?
but the thing is, the research doesn't doesn't really. And I think that's
right.
sort of what's interesting here. There are some things that come out very clearly out of the research. For example, high dose tutoring can improve students' test scores. Okay. And that is in line with other things we know from the research, like small class size is better. So obviously kids learn well from individual teachers. If everyone was, if there was a 1-to-1 student teacher ratio, things would be going better. That's not a feasible policy. And I guess my take on this, just like stepping back, is that part of the problem is that, we have some research studies. They tend to be run, in sort of isolated one school district, a set of schools, very carefully curated to make sure the high dose tutoring is really good. All these kind of controlled things. Then when we put them in reality, they don't implement in the way that even we see in studies. And so really,
because of the scale of it?
Because of the scaling, right.
Yeah.
So, we say high dose tutoring is great. Districts take that. And, the way they do that is they buy every kid access to an online tutoring platform and they give them a login and nobody uses it. It's like solutions that are just not the same as what were being done in the study. And so that tells me, like, in order to figure out some of these questions, we actually need to be using the data from school districts a bit more. Like, we need to exploit the fact that there's 13,000 school districts in the US and they all do their own thing. Like, many of the decisions they make are literally made by the superintendent, the principals, unconstrained. And that is in some ways a little crazy, but in other ways provides a tremendous amount of opportunity to learn, okay, what is this district doing that's working? What's this district doing that's not working? And so I don't think there's enough learning from across districts or even across states. Why has Mississippi's recovery post-COVID been so much better than anyone else's? Shouldn't someone ask? Shouldn't we be asking them what they did? And we have a little bit of a sense, but like, say more. I think there's more opportunity there to learn.
Maybe you didn't mean to make this connection, but I think the diversity across districts, states with respect to education is actually one of the, I don't think the administration is saying this, but could be a reason to say that's why it's okay that we dismantle the Department of Education, because this is a local thing for local families and districts and everyone to figure out. It doesn't need to be controlled. What are your thoughts on the dismantling of education, of the department in Washington?
So I think it's pretty important to be clear to people, almost all the school funding, well over 90%, is state and local funding. So this is an important part of state budgets. It's obviously a very important part of local budgets. The Department of Education provides about 8% of funding, and it's a very specific set of funding for a certain set of programs inside schools, largely serving students with disabilities. Those are very important for the families that benefit from them and very important for school districts because that's a very expensive set of people to serve. But as a share of spending, this is not that large. And I do think that's important to say because sometimes people hear the Department of Education shutting down, like, are we shutting down schools? Is public schooling over? And like, no, that's not, that's just not the way it works. I do think there are some, and maybe I'm sort of speaking out of the space of someone who really cares about data. There are some things that the Department of Education does around data, which I don't think will come back, and I think that's a pretty significant loss.
Can you talk more about what that is and why it's important to have someone who
so the most obvious thing is the Department of Education runs something called the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a set of testing that allows us to basically compare across the U.S. So there's state level testing, but those tests are not the same in every state. And so you can't use them to compare across states and you can't use them to get kind of an overall picture. That test is run by the Department of Education. They also maintain databases of test scores at state levels and of other information about schools. I think without them, that information won't exist. So if you wanted to know, how many teachers are in a given school, if you wanted to study, how does it matter what the student-teacher ratio is, that's going to be very hard to study when there's no Department of Education. And I guess for me, like, keeping people focused on the idea of achievement being an important outcome for kids, an important thing that schools should focus on, I think we lose that, or we're going to lose that if we aren't measuring it.
Yeah, it feels like it provides a level of accountability that would keep states from making their state tests easier to be like, look how great we are at education.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Switching gears, because you can do this, because you can talk about all these things, Emily, which is, why you're a cool cat, to fertility. rates. And if we should pay people to have babies, and the setup is that fertility rates here in the States are below replacement, but that's also the case in most of the rest of the developed world. And some countries are literally, you wrote about this on your newsletter recently, they're paying people to have babies, large payments. Like you can get $10,000 to give birth in Russia. South Korea, there's a big story in the Wall Street Journal the week we're taping this about how they're paying people 14 grand if they get married and bonuses if they match on online dating apps and $770 a month per kid for children under one. Okay. What is your take of the research about if public policy can help with boosting fertility, which is so important for a country for so many reasons? Can it do that? Is that Washington's place?
Yeah, I mean, there are things that I think that Washington, that policy can do to improve fertility rates based on the data. They are mostly not this kind of like everybody gets a, like the Oprah, like everyone, you get a car. It's like mostly not the
you get a car.
Mostly not this sort of large.
That would be fun, though, Emily.
That would be fun. I think there's more evidence actually in favor of, things that are more direct, like childcare subsidies, paid parental leave, things that make it easier, even support for IVF, for example, which makes it possible for people to have kids if they are struggling with fertility. So there are some kind of direct things where policy for sure could matter. I will say that the sort of effect sizes of those things are relatively modest, and you can almost see that from the fact that Sweden and Norway have lower fertility rates than the U.S., despite having tremendous amounts of support for parenting. So I sort of simultaneously would like to say it would be great to have better childcare subsidies. I think it's shameful that we don't have paid maternity leave for everyone. That seems insane. But also, changing those policies, which we should do for many reasons, is not the thing that's going to, return fertility rates to be very high. I'm actually not sure what that thing is. Are there interventions that would get us back, to replacement level fertility? I'm not sure what they are, but certainly there maybe some progress could be made.
Yeah, and I want to talk about paid leave. So glad you brought it up because it feels like there's a bit of a tension now within the Conservative Party and talking about, of course, they're in control of Congress and the White House right now. And on one hand, there's kind of a camp that's really supportive of really cash for kids. So it's not the numbers that we're talking about in South Korea and Russia and all that. But for example, the child tax credit is up for extension this spring. It's currently $2,000 per child from ages 0 to 17. And both Democratic candidate Harris talked about that being $6,000 in the first year. Vice President J.D. Vance has talked about that being $5,000. So there's kind of camp about let's just give parents more cash. And whether or not that increases fertility rates, that's kind of the best way to deliver support. In another camp, and probably admittedly the camp I've spent more time in, is a desire for more targeted interventions, which would be something like paid parental leave, that if you have a child, if you work, most parents work, you can't have job protected paid time off to bond with that child in the vast majority of employment situations. Like that should change. Or if you're a low income family, you cannot afford a high quality childcare setting. And that's really important for the child, for you, et cetera. And there should be specific earmarked childcare funding for that, like we have in the block grant. How do you, with your bird's eye view into the literature, kind of weigh those between a universal kind of cash payment that families can use if they want, and these more targeted in-kind benefits, if you will, that go to solve very specific problems?
So a couple of things. Generally economists would say, cash is more efficient. So, and it's a more efficient way to transfer because if somebody needs childcare and somebody needs, diapers, like people can sort of choose what they're doing. So there's a kind of natural efficiency argument around cash. And there's a couple reasons why I'm not sure that works here. I think they mainly relate to sort of how the things that are outside the household operate. So in a world in which you have, guaranteed paid leave, that changes the way the labor market operates. That means when someone has a baby, they know that they're going to have leave, and their employer knows they're going to have leave, and the employer knows that'll be covered by some payments of some sort, and it makes it easier for that leave to kind of fit inside a continued employment relationship. I think similarly, if you sort of talk about childcare subsidies, one of the values of childcare subsidies is it encourages supply of childcare. So one problem is people don't have supply of childcare. And if you look at what, say, Vermont has been doing around expansion of the availability of high quality childcare, a big piece of that is subsidies to providers to generate spaces in childcare settings that are deemed to be high quality so that people can use them. So giving people $5,000 if they don't actually have a way to get a childcare solution is really not that helpful. And I think the targeted subsidies push the supply side in a way that is probably necessary. And so I think that's kind of the tension I see. I mean, there is a political tension here, I think, which maybe is unsaid, which is the feeling of, well, we don't want to support moms who work. We actually don't want to support the idea of women in the workforce. And so like cash subsidy.
Yeah, or a more neutral version of like, any support given to working moms is kind of putting our hand on the scale against stay-at-home moms.
Exactly. Whatever, and so I think, yeah, that's a sort of nicer form of this. And I kind of see that because I do think we should be encouraging people to make the choices that work for them and under the, constraints and so on of their family. And if that choice is to stay at home, then it would be reasonable to think about how we can provide some kinds of support there as well. But I don't think that this is zero sum. And there are a lot of people who are going to choose to work, and there are ways we can make their lives easier. And I think that we should do that.
And it's why paid parental leave, again, continues to be such important policy reform because it allows more parents to stay home while being connected to the workforce. So it really does seem to satisfy both. Okay, marriage. I was on your Free Press podcast. We talked about marriage. We talked about Melissa Kearney's new book about the two-parent privilege. This has been something, family structure, emphasized by conservatives for a long time, whereas I think kind of more on the progressive side of the aisle, there's been concern that if we champion marriage, it shames single mothers. Again, this kind of dance between these two things. The research on economic opportunity and child well-being is pretty clear that you have more resources financially, emotionally, just time-wise, growing up with more adults in the household as opposed to less. What is your sense of how Washington can address the changing family structure, the dramatic increase in single parenthood, which is having not only, in many cases, detrimental effects in those households, but also for economic opportunity writ large? But then again, I get kind of heebie-jeebies about if public policy is what we should be using to determine, the best way to structure one's family.
Right. I definitely am not supportive of public policies that just make it hard to get divorced or whatever is that, But I mean, look, when on some of those episodes, maybe it was on that episode, maybe it's in a different one, I spoke to Richard Reeves, and who I think for me has really moved my thinking on things a lot. Yes, he has a great accent and also says very smart things. It's like, but, I kind of think the best policy to support marriage is probably policy to support men, which I understand is not a totally uncontroversial statement. But the reality is that, and Richard's made this point many times, when we look out at the sort of fortunes of adult men at the moment in the US, they are not doing as well as women, particularly in the parts of the distribution, the parts of the socioeconomic space that are where marriage rates are low. So, at the top, men are doing fine. Like, no, if you are interested in who's running the Fortune 500 companies, it's men. But when we look in, people with less than a college degree or, other parts of the distribution, working class, we are not seeing success for men the way that we are for women. And thinking about policies that address that gap feels like both important for just people, but also probably core to some of the issues that come up around marriage, because, if there aren't partners who feel like they are going to contribute, then it's not as clear why, marriage seems attractive to people. So rather than going into this as like, let's try to fix marriage and let's have governments mandate marriage, which of course is, both invasive and I think unlikely to work, thinking about how we can support an economic environment in which marriage is an attractive option feels like it's a little more of a win-win.
Thanks for that. last big category of stuff, and you mentioned it at the top, and that's mental health and screens. And I think in a time where there's a lot of political disagreement about so many different things, increasingly, at least it seems from here, that there is a lot of bipartisan momentum about reevaluating technology and the relationship of that with our kids. Wondering if you can chat about that for a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think John Haidt has really moved the needle of this conversation in a direction that feels, largely quite good. For me, the most important and core policy and most important doable core policy thing is phones at school. So these kind of many states have worked on, what we're calling like bell-to-bell bans, having no phones at school. Everyone puts their phone in a Yonder pouch or whatever in the beginning of the day, and they don't get it back until the end of the day. That feels to me totally obvious, completely putting aside any of this sort of mental health, social, et cetera. It's just like literally you're supposed to be learning math, not getting texts from ESPN. And, so like
well, and couldn't, like, talking about a place for Washington, like, if districts don't have enough money to buy such Yonder pouches, couldn't that be if there's something coming from Washington, the Department of Education, to say, we're going to provide you, if you can't afford this yourself, you're going to get a lot, because this just
feels like this problem feels totally tractable.
Right.
And the only complaints you get are people who's, the parents are like, well, I need to reach my kid during the day. It's just like, you don't need to reach your kid during the day. And I think the truth is when schools get rid of phones, people realize it's fine. And so that to me is like the sort of number one thing that we need to do. There's then this second question of, how much should we be like otherwise legislating, kids' relationships with, things like social media or with phones. And I guess I am somewhat more skeptical about technological solutions to these problems. And somewhat more interested in how we can help parents develop the ability to set boundaries here.
So you mean more like less in the vibe of let's have a more strict or lower age limit for social media?
Yeah. Like, there are a lot of these things that are like, let's say you have to verify your age. Let's say, you have to like do this and that. It's like, that's fine. Let's put parental controls on. First of all, your kid knows more about the parental controls than you do. So you're definitely not going to win on that one. But more than that, like eventually kids are going to get access to this. And so this idea of kind of what's going to turn it off and then one day we'll just turn on the spigot and like with no boundaries feels really problematic. I think we just need to help parents. We need to give people more of a scaffolding for like how you can set these boundaries with your kids. I'll give you an example. I talked to somebody the other day who was explaining to me, like, well, my kid got a phone. Like we said, we wouldn't get a phone. Then she got a phone.
All her friends have phones.
Right. And then we said she couldn't have Instagram, but then she got Instagram. And then, we said she couldn't have a private account. Then she got, an account, like a fake Instagram account. And it's sort of like relaying this. And it's kind of like, what are you going to do about this? It's like, we got to help people figure out, like, there are things you could do. Like, you could take the phone.
Right. Put it.
Take the phone. Yeah. Or do something else like that, but the technology is not going to fix that problem for you. People need help fixing that problem for themselves.
Yeah. Well, amen to that. 2 questions to close. God of parenting, Emily Oster. If you could flip one public policy lever to help kids and families right now, what would it be?
It would be paid leave. For sure. I think there's just so much evidence that that's good for kids, good for parents, good for a workforce, good. Like I see no downsides.
Yeah. And because this is beyond talking points, what kind of political talking point, either side of the aisle, doesn't matter, but about family policy drives you crazy?
I mean, I find a lot of the talk around, how to optimize our kids' health and avoiding this and that kind of additive. I mean, this is a more recent thing, but I think that it's just misguided, and it's not the thing that's going to help the most people.
Yeah, especially when there's so much going on impacting kids and families. Yeah. Emily, thanks for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Abby McCloskey, and this is Beyond Talking Points, where we talk about what America was promised and what we're getting. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you next week.